I'd just like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel, he calls himself Mad Dog Madison, who's from the Army School System Directorate, here to do his final briefing. He's got briefing the course for the last 2 years?
Maybe 3, maybe 4.
And this is his final one before he leaves in July. So the floor is all yours.
There's one thing in life that's constant. There is one thing in life that's constant.
You're going to die.
There's one thing in life that's constant. What? Change. Change. The Army has done an outstanding job, primarily teaching us how to maintain the status quo. Hasn't done a very good job of teaching us how to manage change, even though in recent years we see a turnaround in that area when we think about transformation in the Army. We think about jointness. We think about working together. Well, I want you to know that I love my job because I'm a professional change manager. I've been doing this job since January 1999, where my job primarily is to help the components of the Army work together better. Traditionally, the Army has done a very good job of working with our sister services more than we've done a job of understanding and working with the components within the Army. I spent about 10 years on active duty. Then I converted over to the AGR program. I spent about 10 years there. Been working in the job in the Army School System Directorate since January 1999. And I'm retiring in July of 2004. I'm the outgoing Deputy Director of the Directorate. But I tell you that I love my job, but very few people. I feel fortunate because I think very few people get an opportunity to do a job that they love and to see the difference that they make out there within the Army. When I think about my background and I think about my AC experience, that when I was an AC soldier only, it was very difficult for me to understand how the reserve component worked because I wasn't embedded in the system. So in turn, I know that the AC soldier, if you've been an AC soldier all your life, you're thinking that the reserve component works the same way as the AC does, but it doesn't. There's also some value that a reservist adds and brings to the table that you may not be aware of. And as an integrator, helping the components of the Army work together better, I feel like I made a difference in the way the shaping the force and the way it will be in the future. What I'm going to do is I've got a series of slides. There's about 10, 12 slides, a couple of slides that are really filler slides. And what I intend to do is I'm going to show you these slides quickly. I promise you that you'll be able to read my slides, that they will have a single controlling idea per slide, and that you'll be able to explain this stuff after I leave the room. That's going to be important to you. You should be able to know what I was talking about after I leave, because I'm not going to be around after July of 2004. So I'm not going to give you my phone number or email. What we do with the Army school system, we focus on those 3 areas: resourcing, efficiencies, and integration. When you talk about resourcing, what the issues have been is that the reserve component was not resourced at the same level or near the same level as the active component when it comes to institutional training. There was issues with, say, courseware. They call this courseware Reserve Component Configured Courseware, RC3. Everybody knows that courseware, training development, drives the TRADOC training. So what you had was outdated courseware within the reserve component, some courseware a couple of years ago that still had the Jeep in the courseware. Jeep has been out in Army inventory for years. So in turn, TRADOC, the cause for that was that TRADOC was cut training developers. And the training developers that they had on staff were only able to keep the training products up to date for the active component. So the reserve component courseware just sat on the sidelines. But reservists were still being qualified using this courseware, and then they were being mobilized. And when they were being mobilized, they were sent to the to the area of operation, but they had never seen an M1A3. But this guy was a 63 Sierra, a track mechanic, but had never seen one before. Back in his unit, he had M60s. So we have a dilemma here that was really centered around resources, which includes equipment. The efficiencies. You would have all these different school systems. At Fort Lewis, Washington, there were 3 NCO academies across the street from each other. Army National Guard had one, Army Reserve had one, and the active component had one. They were all probably teaching three different courses, three different courses, and using 3 different courseware to teach PLDC. So you combine them. You combine those schools and you capitalize on efficiencies. You don't have to duplicate the equipment requirements. You all use the same building. You use the same electricity. You have 1 sergeant major in charge rather than 3. Makes sense? The integration itself. Across the board, generally there is a misunderstanding of how the components work. Army National Guard primarily works for the state. They have institutions out there. They have a trade-off within the Army National Guard, and each state has their own little trade-off. Each tag or adjutant general of the state can issue 1059s and awards MOSs. But they were doing their own thing, 50 different ways. Then you had the Reserve, Army Reserve, who had United States Army Reserve Forces School, who would take a typical instructor, and that instructor might have 5 different MOSs. Not like an AC instructor. An AC instructor typically has 1 MOS that they're going to teach. But on the reserve side of the house, they may have 5. A reserve officer might have 3 different specialties that they qualified in. It's a different environment. It's a different paradigm when you're dealing with this integration piece. But there's value that can be added using the reserve component, and I intend to show you that today. The agenda that I'm going to follow, simple, and I hope to leave you with some things that you can use out there in your job. But I understand that when you get back to your jobs, there's going to be 1,000 emails sitting in your box. And the last thing you're going to want to think about is what Mad Dog said up here about the reserve component. But one day, somebody who outranks you, or somebody who can influence your future is going to say, what about the reserve component? Then you're going to remember, hey, Mad Dog talked about the reserve component. This is what our mission has been in the Army School System directly. Primarily, it's an integration mission. We've capitalized on the efficiencies, and we want to have one school system. Now, this wasn't an issue until the reservists started being mobilized at a more rapid rate. Before, the description was you go in and you do your duty, you do your 2 weeks, you do your drill every weekend, and then you might have to be deployed periodically, maybe every 3 to 5 years. Well, we got away from that. The op-tempo for the reserve component is very close to that of the active component. There are people who are being mobilized and being sent to the box that are on the reserve side of the house, and then there's active component soldiers who have been to the box, or some that haven't been at all, that are here in the United States. So the mission, scope, and focus for the Guard and Reserve changed. So that meant we need to focus more heavily on making sure that they were trained to standard and that they could do the job to standard when they got into the box. This system began around 1992. The Army School Systems, the Army School System. It used to be called the Total Army School System. Training Force 21, or Task Force 21 was a concept that was developed in around 1992 time frame. In 93, they came up with a pilot. This pilot program began down in South Carolina, where they took those Army Reserve Forces schools and got it done away with. They took them down and formed these battalions, these reserve component training battalions. We refer to those battalions as task battalions. Task is supposed to mean the Army school system. Well, it's a misnomer. When everybody says task, they think of reserve component schools only. That's what we think about. in my office, when we say task, we're thinking about reserve component schools. When you look at these briefing slides, most of the information on the slides is reserve component centric. So I'm not helping you understand that the Army school system is supposed to include everybody. TASK was formed in 1995. Right now, what we did is the primary impetus of the Army school system was going out, taking AC advisors, embedding them out there in these reserve component training battalions. They're supposed to be the subject matter experts out there to help the reserve trained veteran to do quality assurance. Then at the proponent school, we had AC advisors that were missioned to go out to these battalions on a periodic basis every 3 years and accredit them just to look at the training over a period of time and to assist them in ensuring that we train to standard. Then the proponent school commandant signs off on a document giving that school permission to operate over a 3-year period. Then maybe we go back and do some spot checks periodically to see if everything's going well. Over the course of this time frame, we begin our second cycle. Primarily over 90% of those battalions have met the standard over the last 3 to 5 years. Now, also in the regulation, that the AC training battalions or the AC proponent schools were also to be accredited. But it was supposed to be a self-accreditation process. So you had people looking at the reserve component, but you had the proponent school looking at itself. TASK is the Institutional Army's Total Force Integration Bill, meaning that we want to work together better. What we had is those 3 different school systems training to different standards. On the force comm side of the house, they had done a much better job of ensuring that ensuring a force in the integration with the reserve component. We hadn't done such a good job on the TRAOC side of the house. But this organization was stood up. It was called the Deputy Chief of Staff of Education originally. It was stood up to rectify that problem. And please, if you have a problem, a question, stop me so I can discuss it with you at that point. Comprised of all the reserve components and the active components, to include the proponent schools. What that means is that you're, if you have a commandant and you're from a proponent school, you have anywhere from 5 to 7 reserve component training battalions that I'm going to say work for you. They're like franchises of the proponent school. In essence, what they are is decentralized training away from the school, so that it's cheaper for the people, for the reservists. It's cheaper for active component soldiers. Imagine that there's a supply sergeant course being taught at Fort Lewis, Washington by one of the reserve component battalions, but you want to send your AC soldier from Fort Lewis to Fort Lee to get B-knock or A-knock. But there's a reserve component battalion right outside the front gate. They teach training in various modes. They can teach it on the weekend. They can teach a 2x2 training. That means 2 weeks bumped up against another 2 weeks. But on the NCO side of the house, we've met resistance with doing that. The issue has been that the NCOs can't go to training on the weekend. The NCOs can't go to training in the evening. But on the officer side of the house, it's always been happening. The officers were always going to CGSE and CASQ using these reserve component schools. But the NCOs couldn't do it. Then we asked the question, well, why? I haven't gotten a good answer yet. But it saves you money. On the force comm side of the house, if you're a commander and you know that you can still have your soldier, your platoon sergeant available to you, then that's a benefit for you. If you know that you don't have to pay the TDY money to send them back to Fort Lee, that's a benefit for you. But there's a catch to it. The catch-22 is based on resourcing. Proponent schools are resourced based on instructor contact hours. If an AC soldier doesn't come to the school, there's no instructor contact. So what's the benefit for a proponent or a DOT to send an AC student to an RC school? It's not a win-win for them unless you focus in on the integration piece. That when you look around your schools and you find that you're short instructors, You think of where should I go, or where could I go to get an instructor? You can go to the reserve component. But if you don't engage them and ensure they're trained in the standard and use them, just like you would an active component instructor, house them, just like you do an active component instructor, then they're not going to be teaching the standard. They're not going to be a valuable resource for you. When you talk about tasks, primarily it focuses on the training lane, training execution on the RC side of the house. But there's capabilities out there to do doctrine development, to do training development. The 84th Division, all of the rail assets in the Army are in the reserve component, headquartered out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That reserve unit developed the courseware for the tax courseware for rail MOSs. They did it at home station. They did it in Milwaukee. They conferred with the people at Fort Eustis as the proponent, at CASCON. But they did it in Milwaukee. What better people to do it? You can do training development anywhere. The system, the way it's set up right now is that there's 3 lanes. The middle lane where you see tasks, that's a multi-component lane. We've since added the Quality Assurance Office, which is the role is to work together. The Quality Assurance Office, we have assigned our Title 11s, our AC advisors at the component schools have been assigned to the Quality Assurance Offices